Good morning, everybody. This is Amy Woodbury from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I would like to welcome you to the Annex 4 Expert Forum on Environmental Monitoring around turbines. Andrea is just getting off another conference call, and she will be joining this call shortly, and she will provide some introductions, and then we'll go on from there. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to IM me. And especially if you're having any technical difficulties, please do IM me and we'll see if we can troubleshoot for you.
Much everybody for joining us here today, and for those of you that put slides together and work to put this together, I'm very pleased. And you just have some instructions here. Amy Woodbury and Michaela Freeman are looking at this from another room here, so if there's any issues they will monitor. Like if you suddenly can't hear or something goes awry, please just type into the message box there and they'll help deal with that. This forum today, to last about an hour, the point here is really to simply sort of introduce the people involved here to each other, to those who are actively engaged in monitoring around devices, either right now or in the fairly recent past. And the point here really is to ensure that everybody kind of knows what's going on in various parts of the world, to share a very small amount of what they're doing, not any in-depth work because we haven't the time today, and to see if there are some commonalities among these groups for some learning, for some collaboration. And finally, at the very end, I would like to pose the question to you as to whether this is a worthwhile group to pull together from time to time and simply kind of catch up on what's going on in terms of monitoring, common questions, etc. We have run these expert forums, and as you know, they're invitation only, and that's really to just keep the topic focused, to make sure those who are involved are really, those who know what's going on in this field. And we tape them, and I do want you to know that this is being recorded for later posting on Tethys, although if there's anything that goes awry, we do edit them a little bit. And I would like to pose whether it is worthwhile to bring this group back together on an ongoing basis. So, enough of that. We have as you can see, we have quite a number of people who are engaged here, and each of you were asked by me to produce about 2 slides. One, just a very quick overview of what you're doing monitoring-wise, and you can talk through that, but I will ask you to keep it short. And a second slide of your perception of gaps in data that need to be collected, instrumentation that you just don't think is available that ought to be, conceptually how we're addressing monitoring, and how we might move forward in these areas. And here's the lineup, which you see on your screen, and we're going to run just sort of in that order for no particularly important reason. So what I'm going to do, I think, first is Anna and Jason. Are you guys on the phone?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Anna Redden out of Acadia, Jason Wood out of SMRU Consulting are going to talk about marine mammal and fish monitoring they're doing in Bay of Fundy. So take it away, you guys. Just tell us when you want the next slide.
I guess we want the next slide. Okay. Perhaps, Jason, I'll just talk about the fish work and you can follow up on the marine mammals. Is that all right?
Sounds great.
Okay, so a range of different things going on at the force site. We're using both down-looking hydroacoustics and upward-looking sonars. The down-looking hydroacoustic surveys, which are a series of transects that are being done 6 to 9 times a year, using an EK80. For fish density and vertical distribution, University of Maine has been leading that and working with FORCE and helping to train staff there. Some other work using FORCE's sensor platforms involves upward-looking sonars, the AZFP and the EK80, 1 month long sort of periods of time for deployment. And there's a series of these that are happening, and I'm lucky to have Haley Beeman join us here as a postdoc, and she's working with FORCE largely on those deployments and data analysis. We have a Gemini imaging sonar that has been mounted on a Cape Sharp tidal open hydro turbine. This is part of an international project to advance software between communications between hydrophones and the Gemini. There was a deployment in November of the open hydro turbine, and there's an imaging sonar on that for detecting both fish and marine mammals. And I just wanted to mention we have several years of fish tagging and tracking data that we were able to recently use to try to develop probability of encounter models, particularly for one of the fish species, striped bass, that we have quite a bit of data for. And that'll be coming out really soon.
So moving on to marine mammals, on the passive acoustic side, we focused mostly on sea-pod surveys. We have about 2 years of baseline that we've done with Anna and her students at Acadia in and around the Force site. Currently, we've also been deploying these again around the Cape Sharp tidal open hydro turbine location, and those have since been also augmented by 4 IC Listen hydrophones that are recording raw audio data as well that we'll run detectors on. In addition, that Gemini sonar that Anna mentioned earlier for the fish work, we're also planning to use that as part of that same Canadian UK funded project for detecting marine mammals, and has also been working on some drifter survey work with IC Listen hydrophones. And there's also been some land and boat based surveys at fairly low levels. I guess just moving on to seabirds, there's also been some visual survey as part of the Force environmental effects monitoring plan. And then I guess I'll push it back to you for lobsters and the rest.
Yeah, I don't know. Were you interested in anything else there, Andrew?
Sure, absolutely. Anything that you're doing, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, the lobster issue. We don't have a lot of lobster fishers in our area, but they're very vocal, and they've been very concerned about impacts on the lobster populations. There have been a number of sort of catchability studies, very difficult to do these to try to ascertain whether or not catch rate is going to be, is due to development or not. I think DFO is perhaps would prefer that there be tracking studies instead, so that may happen in the future. Some marine noise work being done with drifter surveys as part of Force's EMP. I think Melissa Oldrieve is probably on the line from Force, and she can speak to that later. And some fixed hydrophone deployments, both near and far from the Cape Sharp tidal open hydro turbine, and JASCO is doing that project with Cape Sharp tidal. We have observations by beach walks for mortalities in particular. Some of you may know that we had major fish kill in another part of the province about 150 to 200 kilometers away from Force, and of course was convenient to perhaps tie the operations of the turbine with that, a bit unfortunate. However, Force has a public reporting sort of process in line for people to report those things, and there were no mortalities found anywhere near that turbine in this last mortality event. And I should just mention that this was a fish kill that happened, and there hasn't been any explanation. I couldn't find any particular reason why this did happen. So these are always going to be issues that do come up. I just want to also mention that a number of us have been having some discussions around holding a workshop that would focus on fish in particular, and looking at monitoring and modeling for effects on fish and fish populations. So that's something that a number of people who are on the line have been discussing.
And I think most people on the phone know, but just Force is Canada's tidal energy test site in the Bay of Fundy.
Right. So I guess there are always lots of gaps, but some of the major ones really will be where we're using sonar to detect fish, but we don't have complementary surveys to collect fish to identify the species that are, what's out there and what their relative abundance is. So that's a concern. Been trying to get Department of Fisheries and Oceans involved in helping to survey and collect some of that data. It's not easy, and it's not cheap to do that. So I would see that being a big gap that we would want to try to fill. We do have a bit of fish collection data from local weirs in the Monis Basin at some distance away from forest, and what that is telling us is, at least in the near shore, what the sort of seasonal abundance or relative abundance of different species is. And so that is useful, but it is not doesn't give us sort of direct information at the test site itself. So, and another thing, we have a limited number of acoustic devices to detect fish in particular, and I think everybody involved in this here would prefer that we have a greater number and variety of acoustic devices for detecting near field behavior of fish, and preferably a combination of devices housed on turbine infrastructure as well as on cabled sensor platforms. Jason?
So in terms of the marine mammal side, I think it really boils down to, three theme areas here, and these won't be new. These are sort of echoing what Anna's just said. It also will not be new to the rest of the folks on the call either. It boils down to, one, having enough instrumentation on there to pick up, fine scale movement of different animals, whether we're using passive or active acoustics. The other is really understanding how this instrumentation works in these extremely challenging sites. So I think those are the two main things in terms of instrumentation. And the last theme there in terms of marine mammals is sort of really knowing whether or not that instrumentation is in the end actually going to give us the evidence that we need to say yes or no that a confirmed strike has happened. And that's regardless of whether it's the instrumentation on site or whether it's necropsies from stranded animals later.
Right, and this last thing, and perhaps this is a problem everyone's experiencing now, is we're collecting data and I'm feeling we don't have a real clear plan and good recommended practices for how we manage this data, how we share this data, and how we analyze this data, efficiently and in a timely manner that can get data back to the developers and the regulators.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, you guys. Nice and quick. Next up, and I'm sorry, we are just going to have to crash through these and have some time for discussion later. Next up, Benjamin Williamson with University of Aberdeen, talking about FLOWBEC. So next slide, please. It's all yours, Benjamin.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Stop me if you can't hear me. This is very much the work of my colleagues and co-authors as well. So Beth Scott's on the line with me, but also Sean Fraser, James Waggett, Philippe Blondel, and Paul Bell. So two of the questions that we're looking at in FLOWBEC is, first of all, how do hydrodynamics affect animal behavior, particularly in tidal energy sites? And then secondly, how does the introduction of tidal turbine structures then potentially alter the behavior of animals? So the way that we're going about this is this multi-instrument approach, trying to concurrently gather information on hydrodynamics, animal distribution and identification, and as well animal behavior. And so we're using these instruments listed here on the slide and supplementing this with fluorometer, with cameras, with passive acoustic measurements. And to tie this all together, we've just had two papers accepted on the methods to bring all this information together. And we're using data which were gathered at wave and tidal sites at EMEC, but also baseline data which were gathered at the Majan site back in 2015. We're complementing data from the seabed platforms with boat surveys, so using EK60, ADCP, and observers, and as well trialing the use of drones, UAVs, to gather data on surface mammals and surface seabeds. So that's the way we're trying to go about it, and those are the questions we're looking at. And so then, in terms of gaps, and in terms of some of the research priorities that we're looking at, we talked about measuring these changes in hydrodynamics, and what we're trying to do is develop mechanistic links so that first of all we can observe at the moment when and where animals are in the water column and at different stages of the tide. But what we're trying to do is not just observation, but be able to predict the times when animals might be present or might be foraging, and then any increase or decrease. So first of all, on the right-hand side, changes in predator behavior, all of which will determine foraging efficiency. There's then also times and changes of collision risk for diving seabirds and for marine mammals, which are linked to the prey in these sites, and therefore the hydrodynamics as well. Stop me if I'm missing anything. So the second thing that we're looking at is how changes in prey distribution alter predator behavior at an individual level, so affecting energetics. Then we have a PhD that we're currently advertising for to start in October 2017, which will try and develop the links from individuals up to population level effects, as we try and look for scaling measurements around individual turbines up to arrays of turbines. So the two things that we've highlighted as ongoing research. At the end of last year, we cabled the FLOWBEC platform to one of the MCT turbines. So once commissioned, that will start to bring in a long-term data set to complement some of the mobile platform deployments we've done at EMEC and the MCT site. And then the other thing that we're prioritizing at the moment is algorithm development. So how can we link these different instruments together to gather, first of all, data on the animals and the sites, but also the contextual environmental data to develop these mechanistic links, and then also algorithms for behavioral analysis. Beth, is that complete? Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. Benjamin, did you have any particular gaps you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, so I think the real priority for us is gathering this data around the operational MCT turbine. So we've got a data gap there. In terms of the instrumentation gaps, I think we've got a good suite of instruments here which are able to gather the data we need to fulfill these. So what we're now looking at is taking the data we've already got and trying to supplement it. So we see data gaps, we see some real opportunities for funding that need to be addressed. And then really just trying to take this forward with the resources. Beth, what would you add?
Well, I think in terms of gaps, our biggest problem is to get the data flow started to see, is this all working? There's been a lot of investment in time and effort into getting these instruments to co-register. And also there's been work in the background identifying all the physics, the turbulence structure. So there's one of the new papers out. It should be out right now.
In press.
In press with Sean Fraser as the first author is some of the techniques on how to take out the turbulence, basically, so that we can see this information across the entire tidal cycle. But it's also then now we're at the process where we're looking at that turbulence and trying to predict fish behavior given the structures. So our gaps are mainly in lack of data at the moment. And then it's a matter of, if the instruments can work and if they do co-register, like yourselves, the same things that Anna pointed out, the lack of having the ability to go and look at the actual species, so species ID, although we're trying to get around that by this co-registration on all the different instruments. And then, yes, possibly working more with people who are tagging again, to be able to register when we know a tagged animal is there and be able to use that for basically machine learning issues in terms of being able to species ID in the future. But yeah, that is a big issue then of being absolutely sure which species are which.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Benjamin. Super. Okay, let's move on. Carol and her colleagues are up on marine mammal monitoring in, I think, Scotland and Wales. But take it away, Carol. Next slide, please.
So this slide just presents a very, very high-level overview of all the monitoring work we've been involved in to date. Starting in the top left there with the work that we've been involved in with MCT SeaGen and Strangford Lough, and this should be familiar to most of you by now. And that was a sort of a suite of monitoring a variety of temporal and spatial scales, looking at all aspects of the marine mammal population in response to that single turbine, from shore-based visual observations of sighting rates around the turbine, static passive acoustic monitoring using actually T-pods, the predecessor of C-pods that was that long ago, around the device in the narrows and slightly further afield. We also carried out various field tagging deployments, 3 single deployments of 12 tags in each, one prior to any deployment, a deployment during the construction of the device, and then a third deployment during the main operational phase of the device. And then at the sort of wider population scale, there were annual aerial surveys looking at the seal counts at a regional scale. There was also a mechanical scanning sonar upstream and downstream, sort of forward-facing, that was used in the mitigation that was in place at the time. So if a marine mammal target was spotted on the sonar within a starting range of I think it was 100 meters, which came down to 50 meters towards the end, if a seal was spotted on that sonar by a human operator, the turbine was manually halted. Since that original work, we've been involved in a number of other developments. The next one that came along was the development of the Delta Stream device, the deployment of that in Ramsay Sound, Wales, with Tidal Energy Limited. And this was much more focused on detecting and tracking marine mammals around the device itself. So it was a very particular scale. I'm working with colleagues here at Smith. Sorry, I should have introduced who's actually here with me today. I've got Doug Gillespie, who has led on most of the passive acoustic monitoring stuff, and also Jamie McCauley, who's been working with him on that and developing a lot of the analytical techniques. And I've also got Gordon Hastie, who's developed a lot of the sonar technology and is also working on the seal tagging side of things. So the Delta Stream deployment also had a seabed mounted turbine-facing multi-beam sonar. The PAM array that was mounted on the turbine was relatively successful, and we're currently writing that up to be submitted for publication. And it was proven capable of detecting, localizing, and tracking vocalizing harbour porpoises and dolphins. The sonar wasn't quite so successful. There were intermittent faults and issues with the connection to the sonar. So moving on from that project, we applied everything we'd learned to the next project, which is the MAGEN monitoring one that Benjamin's already talked about in some detail. So we're also involved in the monitoring around that device, and our specific focus is obviously on the marine mammal monitoring. And there we've also got a turbine-mounted passive acoustic monitoring array, which we hope will be as successful, if not more so, than the TEL array. And also a seabed-mounted turbine-facing multi-beam sonar. And where it was a single device at Delta Stream, we've got a configuration with dual stacked device, one on top of the other, which actually allows us to determine the depth of animals that are detected, as well as in XY coordinates. So we can actually reconstruct behaviour in 3 dimensions rather than just in 2 dimensions. And then the fourth project has been talked about at length by both Anna and Jason, and we're working collaboratively with those teams on primarily the sonar data streams. We're less involved in the passive acoustic data, other than to cross-match with any of the sonar detected targets. That's quite a kind of high level, not a lot of detail on any of the particular sort of monitoring technologies or techniques, but I think that hopefully is enough for now, and if anyone wants to talk in detail about any of the specifics, we've got all the right people here for that. So if we move on to the next slide. What I thought I'd put here in terms of needs and gaps and just points that I thought might be useful to discuss were things that have kind of come out of our recent experience on those projects, rather than specific kind of industry-wide gaps. And one of the things that we're certainly kind of seeing is, and it's been echoed by the other speakers before me, that the need for kind of integrated analytical tools to bring data together to look at sort of co-registered data sets, and to actually make use of the best use of those data. One of the things that we have found has been incredibly important across all of these projects is the need for early and direct engagement with the engineers who are working on the development of the turbines and the associated monitoring and sort of control side of things. That a number of problems we encountered could have been solved with earlier engagement, and some of our biggest successes have been as a result of kind of being in the room with these guys from a very early stage, and that's a kind of take-home learning point, I think. The third one, I think that what I found is that sometimes, because the focus is very much on engineering and necessarily so, working with project developers sometimes get to the stage in a project where environmental monitoring starts to kind of come up on people's agenda, that it's often too late for the right kind of budgets to then be mobilised, or the development of the appropriate technologies and techniques in time for deployments. And I think that perhaps there's a need for across the whole sort of project development side of things, for the need to consider what the environmental monitoring perhaps could be a little bit higher up the agenda. And then lastly, I think again it's been mentioned before that scaling from single devices up to arrays is something that needs consideration. Currently there's a lot of assumption that monitoring is only going to be done at single devices, or this type of monitoring of the type that we've talked about, and there'll be no requirement to necessarily monitor at arrays. And is this really likely? We know that the sample sizes from individual devices, or a small number of individual devices, are going to be low. And there's also the fact that different questions are going to be asked as we scale up to arrays from single devices. And also I would echo the point that Jason made about a means of reliable detection of strike is actually going to be quite important. And I think that's it from this end of the list.
Well, we'll just add one thing. It's Doug Gillespie here. It should have been on the first slide, really, so it's not directly associated with a single turbine site, but we have also been developing an 8-channel sort of 3D tracking drifting buoy system for site assessment, try to get a better handle on the 3D distribution of animals in these tidal areas. And there's a paper just gone into press on that now. Otherwise, we're done.
Thank you very much. That was an incredibly compact look at a lot of monitoring you guys have been doing. So thank you very much. Let's move on. Next slide. So Haley Veman, Garrett Staines, and Nate Johnson. I'm not sure how you're going to do this, but talking about ORPC in Cobb's Cook Bay. So
sure.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, this is Nate. I'll just put things in context, and then I'm going to hand it over to Haley and Garrett to talk in more detail. So it's great to hear a lot of familiar voices on the phone and some new ones too. It's been some time. So our Cobb's Cook Bay project is in eastern Maine and state of Maine in the U.S. We had our TideGen device deployed there in 2012 and 2013, and have a data set that certainly initiated before that and has continued after we removed the turbine. We, as required by our federal license, have 6 study plans, which environmental monitoring study plans, which include acoustics, benthic and biofouling, fisheries and marine life interaction, hydraulics, marine mammals, and sea and shorebirds. And Haley and Garrett are going to talk more specifically about the fisheries and marine life interaction plan. I will note that we recently received additional funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, and so have just kicked off the next phase of that project, working on our next generation TideGen device that will really utilize a lot of the data that has been collected to date and inform how we move forward on both monitoring, but then also working with regulators on developing thresholds and ways to quantify impacts, which is a big part of that project. We have successfully implemented an adaptive management process for this project as well, and utilize that to modify our license to try to adjust the levels of monitoring that are proportional to what we know at the time of what the risk is. So very successful project, and happy to see that Haley and Garrett, with so much background on the project, are now spreading their wings to Canada and the Pacific Northwest. So it's great to see. So I'm going to turn it over to Haley, and she's going to talk in more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Yeah, so we have a lot on here. Our work is all from the University of Maine, and Gail Zaleski is actually the PI on all of this. This is from various students and employees over the course of time, but she couldn't be here today. So basically our approach, I think she started this work in 2009, and our approach over that time has been to get some understanding of what the natural patterns in fish presence and behavior are at the site in Cobscook Bay. Use that in combination with behavior of fish near turbines to calculate the likelihood that fish would interact with turbines at this site, and to compare over time. We had a control site and a project site to see if we can detect changes caused by the turbine potentially at the project site. So to do this, we've stitched together a lot of different studies on a lot of different spatial and temporal scales. We had a physical sampling study of the Cobscook Bay in general that was carried out for several years. That was to supplement the acoustics data and get an idea of what species we were looking at. We looked at near-field interactions of fish with the beta tidal device back in 2010 using Ditson acoustic cameras. So it's just 24 hours of observation up and downstream. We only looked at, that was about 3 meters up and downstream of the turbine. We carried out, from 2010 to 2014, stationary downlooking hydroacoustic surveys from a boat that took place at the project site where the turbine was going to go, and a control site. And by doing before-after control impact comparisons at those sites, we we could look for turbine effects. We only had 3 samples with taken while the turbine was present, so that's, you'll see on the gap slide. We'll come back to that in a minute. We did mobile hydroacoustic transects, also downlooking. That took us from 200 meters upstream of the turbine to about 10 meters away from it before the acoustic interference took over. So looking at how the vertical distribution of fish changed over that space, and Haiju Shan, a postdoc with us, used that to put together a probability of encounter model where we looked at the likelihood that fish would even, that a fish upstream of the turbine would even encounter the turbine itself, which was about 5%, turned out. And that also started telling us a little bit about what we're calling kind of the behavioral footprint around this device. So where we start seeing changes in fish behavior up and down and to the sides, and basically a decreasing number in fish was 140 meters upstream of the device. So avoidance potentially starting as far away as that, which is very interesting. We had ORPC deployed a stationary side-looking hydroacoustic echo sounder on the seafloor that looked kind of across the face of the turbine. And so we were able to use that to look at fish behavior as they approached or departed from the turbine, depending on the tide. And so that was spanning about 7 to 15 meters from the device. So we kind of saw that fish, we only looked at the horizontal movement for some other issues, and we could only look when the turbine was there, but the brake was on because of some interference with the data transmission. So static turbine, we compared that to no turbine. And we also looked at 2 years from that same setup. We have 2 years of data collected of hourly fish passage rate right in front of the turbine, looking into detail into the patterns of fish presence at that site, how they relate to natural cycles, and how this might influence study design for a long-term study. I think that's pretty much all of it. Garrett, do you want to add anything to this?
Just one quick thing at the very top with the physical fish sampling. I know Anna was bringing this up, and just the difficulties that we're facing in all of our sensor development. The physical fish capture is certainly not excluded from this difficulty. So there are certain species that are difficult to capture with trawls, with seine nets, etc. So there's possible room for development in that part as well. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's true. And this is all work, so Garrett and I have moved on, but Gail is still working with ORPC, and I believe will continue working in Cobscook Bay and Western Passage in the coming years, kind of continuing along this trajectory. Okay, I think we can move on to the gaps now. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the first one was basically we need more information collected when the turbine is present and operating. So we had a lot of data collection, but most of it was without the turbine. And when we did collect, when the turbine was there, we didn't get enough samples in before it was removed. So that's something we need to work on just to get a good comparison. Sorry. I think that was Nate maybe added the next one. Would you like to elaborate?
No, that's me. That's just
sorry.
Just again, that kind of is related to getting devices in the water. So in order to start capturing data, to start troubleshooting sensor development, that sort of thing, we need again devices in the water. So.
So just get those down. Like we mentioned just previously, long-term monitoring is very important for getting any understanding of how marine animals are using these sites. So getting that conversation started long before a device is in the water is really necessary and has to be more common, I think. Next, getting observations on multiple spatial scales, so near field as well as far field, and that also goes for temporal scales, so trying to collect the long-term data. We need to start putting some of these different observations together. We can't obviously see all of them with any one piece of equipment, so this is when I think it's important to start drawing together different research groups using different methods and using multiple within your own group as well. Getting a better understanding of how fish use these environments with very fast flows in the first place is necessary to estimate how likely they are to encounter turbines and to help inform models that are leading us on to effects at higher levels. And we need to begin planning to assess scaled up effects of these devices as they turn into arrays. We're going to need different monitoring approaches to larger areas like that. So need to start thinking about that. And sensor technology and data processing burdens. Was that you, Garrett? Would you like to?
Yes, I think this is one that everyone sort of is on board with, is just trying to detect fish strike or dealing with the complex environments that we're trying to collect data in.
Yeah. And I had one more that I forgot to put on here, which was the need to start comparing sites. We need to start, getting some data collected at multiple different locations and seeing what we can generalize across sites and what we can't, to start informing guidelines for monitoring these areas. And that's all that I had. Garrett or Nate, do you have anything to add before we move on?
No, all set. Nice job.
Same here. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, you guys. Okay, next slide. Again, it's Nate, and in this case, Sherry Mantzner, talking about fish interactions around a different ORPC turbine in Alaska. Next slide, please.
Sure, this is Nate. I'll just provide some more background, then similarly I'm going to turn it over to Sherry. So our project is in a remote village in Alaska called Igiagig, which is on the Kvichak River, which is the outlet to the Lake Iliamna, which is the biggest lake in all of Alaska. We deployed there both in 2014 and 2015 with our RivGen device, which is similar to the tidal device, cross-flow horizontal turbine, and although a smaller turbine. And we learned a lot of data. We worked in 2014. There was a demonstration. There was our device as well as another device. We worked with several other companies to develop a monitoring plan that incorporated video, because this is a bit different from a tidal environment. It's relatively shallow, relatively clear water, which provides a great opportunity to use other types of technology. So in 2014, we collected data. 2015, we made some enhancements to the turbine, and we also were able to deploy earlier in the year and capture a good chunk of the sockeye salmon run, which is the largest in North America. So within being in the water for the first couple of weeks, there were over 1.5 million adult sockeye salmon that passed through the stretch of the Kvichak River, which was a great opportunity to collect interaction data. From a regulatory perspective, we continue to work on the federal licensing process for a permanent installation in Igiugig, and a lot of the concern from a regulatory perspective is the out-migrating salmon smolt. So we're continuing to work with Gale at the University of Maine and others to look at that aspect. The other work that is going on that Sherry will detail is that we have a pretty voluminous data set from 2015 on fishery interaction and video, and there was a duty cycle that was required or proposed as part of our monitoring plan. So we had a lot of additional data that hadn't been evaluated, and the Pacific Northwest National Lab has taken on a project to look at that data in more detail and also look at algorithms to prove that analysis process. So it's a great opportunity for us, great opportunity for the industry. And Sherry, you want to talk about that in more detail?
You bet. Thanks, Nate. Yeah, so we have all the video data that was collected during that deployment, and as Nate said, we're basically doing two things with that data. One is attempting to actually visually analyze the whole data set, and Garrett's actually involved in that effort as well. And then the part that I'm involved in is developing algorithms to automate, or at least partially automate, the analysis to make video more feasible as a sensing mechanism. And so what we're doing is basically we took a subset of that video data and created a test set. So we took a sample that included examples of both nighttime, daytime recordings, small fish, large fish, fish moving in different directions. And also what's nice about this data set is that there's a total of 5 different cameras, and so each camera provides a slightly different view. So it's actually a really nice data set. And as far as the algorithms, we're applying computer vision algorithms to both try to improve the contrast between fish and maybe the background. Now this is a moving river, of course, so there's lots of debris and lots of noise and so forth in the video. So that's one of the challenges, especially for detecting small fish, which are often not much bigger than some of the pieces of debris that are flowing through the river. So there's a number of challenges. We're still in progress examining different types of algorithms. We have been focusing mainly on background subtraction type approaches where, and these are advanced background subtraction because it has to deal with a dynamic background, and we're having, I think, good success in sort of eliminating a lot of the background noise, but not all of it. And so that's the stage we're at now, is now how can we better discriminate between fish and not fish in the objects that we have left once we apply that initial background subtraction. And the other thing that we're looking at that will be combined with that approach is an optical flow, which is a terminology from computer vision. It just means looking at the movement of segments of a video from frame to frame. And this will help us characterize movement within the frames. And the hypothesis is that the movement of fish, because it would be some sort of directed movement, would be distinguishable from movement of objects that are just floating along with the current, and or the movement of the turbine itself. So that's where we're at now. We're leveraging code that was developed by another project called Fish for Knowledge. You may have heard of that. It also used video cameras that were deployed long term and resulted in hours and hours and hours of video. And so there was a team of researchers that developed code for analyzing this. And so we're leveraging what they did and then, building on that to try to address this data set that we have now. And at the same time, while we're doing this development, we're trying to keep in mind more general type circumstances, like how would data that was collected in open water as opposed to in a river maybe be different from this, because it would be great to develop algorithms that are generally applicable. And so we're hoping to be able to apply this work to additional data sets maybe that were collected in open water. That would be a little bit of a different sort of environment.
Great. Thanks so much, Sherry and Nate. Do you guys have anything on gaps?
Yeah, I think I made a very short list. Is there a second slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this echoes some of the things that other folks have said so far. Confirming an actual strike, is difficult. Even with the video, it's difficult to be really certain that a fish actually collided with one of the blades. So that there definitely work needs to be done there. Underwater video is challenging for a number of reasons, and so maybe some better sort of underwater video technology, and then a way to perhaps combine sonar, active acoustics with video, because I think each of those sensing technologies has strengths and limitations, of course, that could be very complementary. Nate, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'll just I'll add a few things as challenges is working in these northern environments. The seasonality aspect is certainly can be a challenge, and so there's a need to collect additional data during different times of the year. And also ice is an issue that we need to understand better. So that is something that we're working with the University of Alaska on characterizing the ice conditions as well. So ongoing things, challenging environment, but certainly a lot of progress being made. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, you guys. Next slide. Okay, Jonathan Colby and Chris Tomachek are going to talk to us about the Wright project, I think.
I'll try to be quick. I know we're coming up. Next slide. I know we're coming up on the hour, and I'm sure you're hoping for some additional discussion. So hello, everyone. Jonathan Colby. I've been with Verdant for just over a decade at this point, and we're going to talk about the Wright project. Wanted to start with our previous environmental findings and also some of the ongoing work that we're doing. It's going to be pretty similar, it sounds like, to quite a lot of the other work. Here's a summary. Used fixed hydroacoustics or split beam transducers. Two of the main findings there, and we show it in some graphical form here. We found a strong seasonal signature that was associated with migration. You can see that in the upper right figure. And then in the lower right figure, we also clearly identified a spatial and temporal distribution that definitively showed fish preferred near shore and slack. And so you can see on the right, the red colors show higher densities of fish, and if you look in the center at slack, you can see the highest number of fish counts were during the slack tide period as well. If you'll notice, everything in italics are the same conclusions drawn using different technologies. So we feel pretty confident that we are able to characterize the behavior of fish both spatially and temporally. We used high-resolution sonar, or DIDSON, confirming a very limited number at the rotor disc while the turbines were operational. We did see some evidence of avoidance, but as some of the other researchers have noted, that's much harder to quantify. We did netting as well, and we found very few fish in the mid-river at peak velocities, confirming evidence that was found in the either split beam or DIDSON. We have been doing a tag species detection protocol using VEMCO tags for the last 5 years. Been a highly successful monitoring tool for us in terms of species identification, but also understanding the macro scale usage and fish behavior. We've seen, interestingly enough, the majority of fish use the west channel of the East River, not the east channel of the East River. And so this reduces the likelihood of impact or interaction, given that the vast majority of fish are using the west channel, not the east channel. And from that VEMCO data, we've seen that the vast majority of fish are detected either at or near slack, again, confirming what we've seen from the hydroacoustics and the DIDSIN, and also from the netting. We were required to do some seasonal bird observations where we really detected no change in bird behavior. We've done underwater noise studying where we've shown at the right site that anthropogenic noise is often greater than or at least equal to the turbine noise itself. And Verdant has done significant work in collision risk modeling using empirical data on fish distribution, fish behavior, etc. And we've really shown that the likelihood of interaction is de minimis. I heard a number like 5% thrown out previously in this call. And I think the Verdant data suggested even less likelihood of interaction than that, down below 1% for the right project. And we, in fact, did model an array of machines and have showed that even with 30 turbines operating simultaneously, that likelihood of interaction is very, very low. Chris, you want to add any additional comments on this and the collection efforts to date?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything. We do have the next slide, which shows some of what we feel are the data gaps.
Yep, and I'll, if you want to start off on the next slide, Chris, I'll let you mention the gaps.
Go ahead.
All right, so Verdant kind of looks at the gaps in the environment in a three-pronged. The first is proportionality. We really feel that monitoring of key issues should be done in proportion to the project and the scale of impact or potential impact. And we definitely think a gap is in the funding, and that there really should be additional funding for the monitoring of full-scale demonstrations, which would inform the needs at commercial size operating arrays. I certainly believe monitoring at arrays will be required. We have in our FERC license a requirement for 6 or 7 monitoring of environmental effects as our array grows. And so, we did collect data with the 5 operating machines, but that has not prevented additional monitoring as we move to a 30 turbine array. So I think we're very aware of the need for some monitoring at array scale. We talk about gaps in terms of the cost value proposition. We think that there could be additional work using collision risk modeling for larger vertebrates and marine species that have additional behavioral complexity beyond just the fish species that we've modeled, which include Atlantic sturgeon and striped bass. And I think this has been mirrored and commented on by multiple experts, but it's really a gap in terms of developing monitoring equipment that is both robust enough to survive in the high energy tidal environment. We have certainly had trouble with equipment that was not actually designed to operate in an environment that we're putting it in. But then this equipment also needs to be cost effective to either own or rent, depending on the application, but also cost effective to deploy and then operate. And then finally, we really think that funding and the technology transfer side have some gaps. We really encourage and are lobbying for the funding of multiple-year adaptive management efforts of full-scale devices and utility-size arrays to confirm the long-term environmental compatibility. So again, we know that there'll need to be array monitoring, and would really look to get external funding to help support that monitoring of large-scale arrays. And we, I saw this on a previous slide, also really encourage the research community to share data regarding tagged species detections. As I mentioned on the previous slide, our tagged species detection protocol has been very, very useful. I think a very positive and productive effort. But we need to make sure that there's a really positive way to share data to ensure a broader understanding of fish passage and also behavior, all of which goes to support the modeling efforts, which I think, as we all know, are the most cost-effective way of predicting strike or interaction, or the lack of strike, as our experience shows. Chris, anything else?
No, I think you got it covered. Thanks.
Yeah,
Great.
Thanks everybody for including us.
Great, you guys. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Sue Barr, I don't think we have any slides from you, Sue, do we?
Yeah, my apologies to everyone on the call. At the beginning of a new year, we have a new CEO and a new launch of DCNS Energies. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly around the work that Open Hydro has been doing across our global portfolio. I don't have any slides, so do accept my apologies, and Happy New Year to everyone. It's great to be on the call. Really quite briefly, you would have seen a lot of reference to Open Hydro and monitoring happening in the Bay of Fundy. I also wanted to highlight some of the monitoring we've been doing at the European Marine Energy Centre, which was the basis of a paper on fish interactions that we published a good few years ago. That really was a camera-based informative study looking at predominantly aggregation of pollock in the area and looking at their behaviour around our research platform. So the camera nominally sits sort of a couple of metres below the water, and really we can only collect data and see the fish when we have daylight hours. But in 7 iterations of turbines on that platform, we've continuously monitored video data, and a few years ago we were able to analyse that utilising really a methodology that looked at taking screenshots of the aggregations of fish. So anecdotally, we understood that the fish were really arriving at different states of the tide, and behaviourally using the platform for a feeding mechanism. So in low states of tide, the fish were aggregating on the lee side of the turbine and the platform itself, which would be to anyone involved in fish biology standard behaviour. When you're in high flow environments, the fish tend to find shelter downstream of any kind of fixed structure. So that we did see that type of behaviour. We managed to analyse the data to what we wanted really to look at was to combine that data with 2 Nortec Aquadop current profilers that we had facing upstream and downstream of the turbine to get a feel for whether we could link fish behaviour to tidal flow, time of day. The data set was very small. That was a criticism of the work. And we've been looking extensively at extending that. So the findings from that work very much were limited by the data set that we had, but came down to the following, that really we'd understood that there were gaps in the knowledge on ecological interactions with tidal turbines, and this integrated video and ADCP methodology was really only effective at our research platform where the turbine wasn't fully deployed in sort of 40 metres of water. The surveys identified fish to be temporarily aggregated around the turbine, but that was very heavily influenced by velocity rates, and that the behaviour was really acting as a refuge or a feeding site. So we're trying, I suppose, extensively across all of our sites to build on that initial understanding. Some of the areas you would have already heard about in terms of what's happening at force and the need for the species level identification and abundance, and that links to both marine mammals and fish, and that we have some acoustics on that particular deployment. So we have fixed hydrophones in the Gemini imaging sonar, active acoustics looking at interactions with that turbine. I think really drawing together on that, all of our previous speakers have stated the same facts, that there are certainly gaps in the ability to understand species level interaction, strike at the turbine, and really that sort of near scale interaction and behaviour. Some of the gaps that certainly we're experiencing would be around the data transfer, data management, and the post-collection analysis of the data to ensure that we're getting really good, robust science from the data collected at the sites. I would echo the point on funding and getting to array scale understandings. So just to push back a wee bit on whether we see environmental monitoring being important, we certainly do. I think the integration of equipment into the deployment of large gravity-based foundations, such as the Open Hydro device, has its challenges. Is it the most cost-effective way of doing this, and does it give us the best coverage in terms of the data coming back from those and the ability to understand the species-level interactions? So I think funding is going to be a key issue. I think on the back of that, the standard methodology and the ability to transfer data and understanding from one site to other locations is a real gap for us. So we find that we can certainly monitor at individual devices. We get a limited level of understanding of species interactions at that particular deployment site. And then we are looking at trying to take that understanding into other regulatory environments. And often we're stopped in terms of it not being applicable. So you'll often hear regulators say, well, that's great, you've monitored at one site, but that's not applicable to ours. And I think certainly in terms of the monitoring on a array scale, it's something that we've been looking across the academic environment and population really to try and get an understanding of how can we scale up and what is effective in terms of monitoring at array scale. So it's very much on our horizon in terms of trying to understand the types of equipment that might be available coming forward when we have array scale deployments, and also how we'd manage the data. I think one of the key things for us really is methodology and data management. So really echoing a lot of the gaps and a lot of the issues that have been applicable to other device developers, but certainly I would refute the fact that it's not important to us. Certainly we know from monitoring plans, we know from consenting that we simply will not get future projects developed if we're not doing the right thing now to understand these issues. So happy to work and glad to be on the call to sort of share ideas on how we take this forward and make sure that we're getting the right data and the right analysis for future developments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sue. Well, thanks to everybody. Boy, that was a very quick sprint, and everybody did great. So it's past the time we indicated, but I don't want to cut this off if there is some small amount of conversation that needs to go on. And then I'd like to just spend a minute or two sort of pulling out a few themes I thought we heard and talking about some next steps. So maybe I'll go ahead with that first and then see if people want to spend some more time. I think we've heard a lot of, actually a lot going on when you look at the sort of the sum of all this, and no doubt we've missed some. There's a lot of good thought that has gone into development of instrumentation, particularly linked instrumentation with what do I want to say, co-location, codependence of instruments and handoffs and so on and so forth. There's been a lot of thought has gone into, particularly in these high flow, high energy environments, how you really look at these interactions. The marine mammal and the fish, what you're really trying to look at differs a little bit, but obviously we have very similar kinds of challenges understanding what's going on up close to a turbine. I think I'm hearing across the board everybody feels that we still have a real paucity of data, and it's very difficult to get large data sets, but you know there's a need for it. I think we also heard some interesting if you want to call it non-scientific or non-technical aspects to it, and that is one near and dear to my heart. This whole issue of transferability of data sets continues to really limit us. I think ensuring some standardization so we can bring data sets together, make sure that if we're not measuring things exactly the same way, we're at least measuring the same variables. Also talk of tech transfer and outreach needed to make sure that the information is sort of broadly shared. Those are the big ones I got across the board. Maybe I'm missing some, but I think everybody had some really interesting material here. The slides, assuming everyone's all right with it, and we will check with each of you. Those will go up on Tethys along with a recording of this session. Again, we'll edit out anything weird. And that's about it. I want to put in one quick ad and then turn it over to see what sort of discussion we might have. I want to note that in case any of you haven't been spammed already, the UTEC conference to take place next August, September in Cork. The call for abstracts closed last week, and then they opened it up again, and it's open till January 27th, and we are looking to have several good environmental sort of interaction sessions as we did at the last one in France. Please, there's some amazing stuff going on here. Consider getting an abstract into UTEC if you can. But with that, I'd like to just turn it over. Does anyone want to jump in and have any discussion? Perhaps express what your thoughts are. This was fun here today. You'd like to do it again. You'd like to move on to some other more detailed topics, or what?
This is Sherry at PNNL. This was great, and thank you very much, Andrea, for getting us all together. I think this is very useful. And I think we should definitely meet again now that we've gone through the introductions and, kind of got this part out of the way. Maybe the next meeting we could focus on a specific topic, maybe one of the gaps, that was identified during this meeting. I think that would be very useful.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to say that I found this incredibly useful and interesting, and I've learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know was going on, a lot of detail about stuff that I think need to go away and think about and come back to. I'm really glad that my comments, my somewhat kind of a little bit provocative comments about array scale monitoring were picked up by a number of people, and I'm really keen to pursue that conversation, those discussions. Really heartening to hear the development supportive of array scale monitoring, and Sue, I think, mentioned that the challenges of the kind of turbine mounted and turbine integrated instrumentation at array scale, and that's a kind of issue that I think would be very useful in discussing. So I personally, amongst probably all the other gaps as well, I would like to see sort of some further focused discussion on that array scale monitoring issue.
This is Jonathan with Verdant. I also found this and really appreciate everyone's input. I feel like another high-level takeaway is that with all of this monitoring, no one has evidence of fish strike, that there is zero evidence of fish strike that's been detected. And I think that's a really important finding, is that with all of this research and all these various places, not seeing definitive evidence of fish strike. And I think that's an important takeaway.
Mm-hmm. We've seen some fish interaction, haven't we, Sherry?
Yeah, interaction, but not necessarily strikes.
No body parts. It's funny, Jonathan. I always used to say we've never seen an animal, collide with a turbine. And now I'm a little more careful and say we've never seen a marine mammal collide with a turbine. We've seen fish obviously go and hit parts of the turbine, but they just sort of sit there for a minute and then swim off. So, but clearly there's still no detrimental interaction that's ever been seen.
And I appreciate the difference between the term interaction and the term strike. And I would never say there's no interaction, but I think it is important that we share this message that there's no evidence of strike, no direct evidence.
Andrea, it's Sue here. I just want to follow on from that. I think one of the key issues that I have is transposing the scientific evidence into something that is palatable for regulators who make the decisions. So this idea that the data that you have is never sufficient, there's always more data required. And I think this is a really good forum for everybody to work together to get to a common methodology that can be understood by those making decisions on these projects, because at the moment we're all working very hard to make sure that we're not having an environmental impact, but being able to translate that into something that people can sign off on is a real challenge. The goalposts for developers are constantly moving in light of new information, new technology, new data, and we need a way to make this cost-effective, good science, good data, and and acceptable to regulators, so that they can say, yeah, we fully understand there aren't impacts that are negative on the environment. So I think how we translate the science to regulatory decision makers' standards is a real ask from this group, from my side.
Fantastic point, and it actually falls right into one of our Annex 4 agenda items for this next couple of years, is to work very directly with regulators in all these countries to make sure they understand what science has been done and really try to get at this. How much is enough? How do we transfer data sets? How do we standardize? So yes, I think it's a fantastic goal, and we're going to start to take a crack at it with some U.S. regulators this year and move it out to the other countries after. And the people on this call could be incredibly helpful to us. So great.
Right.
Andrea, can I come in? It's Beth Scott here. I couldn't agree more. We're just in the process actually of finally getting a paper in that looks at trying to use the same or similar methods for just seabird surveys, on the surface, nothing so complicated. And it's taken years, even though we all shared our methodologies years ago, to try and be able to do just that. And again, getting it published and getting it out there, has taken a lot because of the differences between sites and so forth and so on. So absolutely, I couldn't agree more. That's us getting together right down to the nitty-gritty of variable definitions, rates and time frames at which you're going to look at things per hour, per second. What are we looking at? And when are we looking at means of things, or is it the variance that's more important? These sorts of things have popped up with this other study. So I think the sooner we do that, the better. And then that all goes down the road of what Sue and yourself were just saying about then also getting together about translating that to developers. We've all now had experience working directly with developers, and it's lovely to have Sue on the call here. It's a real challenge to get that kind of back and forth with developers and some understanding of what level they need to hear it at, and regulators as well. And I think we all have a lot of experience, and we should be thinking about a workshop that does that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I want to be mindful of people's time. So follow up here. I think I heard enough positive, this is a good interaction. So here is my suggestion, open to amendment, that we make sure everybody's on a list here, that we plan another one of these forums or a series of them. But first we'll get a list of some of the suggested topics here today that we've just mentioned out to you, and get some consensus around what people are interested in, and then try to put a series of these forums on, and people can be, come into the ones they are interested in or not, and add some suggestions. So we'll go ahead with that and get these slides and discussion tape out, and we will ask that it's all right to post your slides. If it's not, that's fine too, and just kind of go on from there. So if that's acceptable, expect to hear from us fairly soon. And otherwise, I just want to thank everybody's really great efforts getting some slides together, some good open conversation, and obviously there's a real interest in groups like this of really moving this forward and doing it collectively, and I think that's fantastic. So any last parting words from anyone?
Andrea, just to say thanks for organising. It's been really insightful, and I just wanted to say one thing before I drop off the call, which is EMF, and I hadn't heard it mentioned. It's becoming, again, back onto the agenda for us in terms of environmental impact assessment and understanding electricity in water from turbines. So if I could just leave you with that, that would be great.
Wonderful. Good point. Yeah, I'd heard that recently. The UK is getting spun up on that one. By the way, I'm also going to take the opportunity to send you all a little write-up that I did. There is a workshop planned in Scotland in May on management measures. How do you look and deal with some of these things throughout the development process, before, during, after, and just sort of get your input. Right now it's pretty Scottish specific. We have the opportunity to make it more international if there's interest. I'm going to get that out to you guys too, and just try and get some feedback. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for the time. Thanks for the effort, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Nate.
Everyone.
So long.
Bye.